Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I am delighted to welcome you to this, our webinar on ensuring Canadian language compliance with AI translation. My name is Coleman Murphy. I'm part of the Smartcat team, and I'm joined today by Wada'a Fahel, also Carrie Fischer from Subway. Good morning, Carrie. And Jean-Luc Sayard from Smartcat. So our agenda is primarily focused around the Canadian legislation. Many people are really familiar with Bill 96 Quebec, and we will be talking about that, but there are many other legislations, so we'll touch on those as well. And then we'll get into a couple of case studies, one, Carrie Fisher and her experience at Subway, and Wada'a and her experience at Harley-Davidson. And then following that, we'll have a roundtable discussion and Q&A that will be led by Jean-Luc and with Carrie and Wada'a's participation, covering both best practices from a business perspective, as well as the tools and technology that you should plan to use. So let's just touch really briefly on Canadian language legislations. And let me open with a very big statement, which is, we are not representing any kind of legal point of view in this webinar. We are not experts in legal practices. We don't know your business, and we don't know every legislation that applies in Canada. So please take this as a guideline. We're definitely going to cover some details. And as I said, we are going to share a one-pager afterwards that will contain a little more detailed information on these legislations listed here. But broadly broken out, there are two main categories. There are federal legislations in Canada, and then there are provincial legislations. So within Canada, there's the Official Languages Act of 1969, and this was revised in 2019, which mandates the use of multiple languages when doing business in Canada. And that's not just limited to French and English. To be clear, there's also the Indigenous Languages Act of 2019, which, although a separate act, is in the same spirit that people need to be able to communicate with government and communicate with each other in their preferred language of choice. And sometimes that isn't French or English, that's an Indigenous language. So that is codified into federal regulations in Canada. And then in addition to that, there are provincial legislations. And of those, the one with the most teeth, because it serves the biggest population, and because there's a significant amount of good reason why they want this legislation. In Quebec, the Charter of the French Language, which was passed in 1977, not only provides equal access to French and English, but actually sets French as the preferred language for communication. So whatever you're doing in Quebec, under the Charter of the French Language Act, you are required to have it in both French and English. And we mentioned Bill 96 at the start of this call, so that is an additional level of this act that has even more power of authority, and I'll cover that in the next slide. But Quebec is a huge province with a lot of French speakers. I think there's over 4 million of French language first speakers there. So it's not just that it's a draconian act that's there to make life more difficult for people. It truly is a reflection of the population of that province and the need to serve that population in an appropriate manner. And when it comes to business, especially, it's also an opportunity for all of you. You have the opportunity to engage with a huge population in the Quebec region, but across Canada as a whole, by taking the step of making sure that all of your communications, all of your materials are available in French as well as English. But there are others. New Brunswick, the Official Languages Act of 2006, and in Ontario, going all the way back to 1986, the French Languages Service Act all also exists. So if you're doing business in those provinces, you need to be aware not just of the federal legislation, but also of these provincial legislations. And as I say, this list is not comprehensive. It is not legal advice by any means. So you should make sure that you work with your own legal and compliance department, as well as people in region who can keep you apprised of what is coming or what already exists and help you gain compliance and stay compliant. All right, so let's talk about Bill 96. There's an expectation of full compliance of the word of the law by June 1st, 2025. It applies to all businesses, regardless of size or industry. There are some additional requirements if your business has more than 25 people. So you need to be conscious of that. The bigger your business, the more this ruling will affect you, or this legislation. It impacts customer service. So if you've got any kind of an environment where you're interacting with the public, whether that's your government agency and you're providing services to the public, whether you're a restaurant chain or a dealership, and it applies to both in person, so signage, for example, but also over the phone, on the web, any other communication channel. You need to be compliant here. It applies to legal documents. So if you're signing contracts in Canada, you need to understand that this has specific components to the legislation that require that French be the native language of a legal document. Not always something people think about. And then it applies to general things around your products and services, so signs, packaging, label, and so on. The fines are not to be messed with. So previously, the fines for non-compliance on this were about $3,000 per incident or offense. The first incident fine is now $30,000, and those can be multiplied for additional offenses. And as we'll hear in one of the case studies, it's not just the potential for the fines themselves, but there's a massive potential risk to your business if you're a repeat offender, including having your business shut down. So this is not a bill to be messed with. This is a bill to be embraced and to make the spirit of it part of the spirit of your business, so that you can be really successful in both the provinces and across Canada. Once again, not giving you legal advice. You should be working hand in hand with your own legal and compliance department to get the full details of these legislations, to understand how you should interpret them for your own business. And we do have a blog post on the Smartcat website. If you go to smartcat.com/blog/bill96, you'll get a little more detailed information. But in any scenario, like, go to the source, go to your own legal department to understand this and other legislations that can impact you. All right. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Wada'a Fahel, and she is going to talk a little bit about her experience at Harley-Davidson.
Thanks, Coleman. All right. Well, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I want to start off by talking a little bit about the Canadian market. I think in corporate America, we take part of the blame in not understanding the Canadian market or underestimating the requirements. We tend to focus on EU regulations in our GTM strategy. Because Canada is our neighbor up north, the language is the same. We have a lot of cultural similarities, so we're going to be just fine. And then we enter the market aggressively, and we end up dealing with unexpected regulations and compliance, and then we have to run around to make sure that we're compliant and that business is not impacted. We've learned this the hard way during my time at Harley-Davidson, and in my experience, I noticed that you have to fit as a company, you have to fit a certain profile to be targeted by law enforcement. One, you have to be a big logo. And second, you have to have a brick and mortar environment, right? So a dealership, a store, a restaurant, because as of today, the Canadian regulation or the OPC, which is l'Office de la Protection du Consommateur, did not find a way to crack down on digital yet. So if you're in a brick and mortar environment capacity, and if you're a big logo, you have to be very careful when entering the Canadian market. Now, in the case of Harley-Davidson, the markets were structured differently, right? We had over 96 markets. Some of them were sub-market subsidiaries, and the others were direct dealer markets. So by contract, the direct dealer is responsible for fulfilling translation requirements across all markets, not just Canada. As far as subsidiaries are concerned, Harley-Davidson HQ is responsible with providing or tasked with providing localization. Now, you could put this in a contract with your direct dealer, but it doesn't mean that they're going to fulfill this contract, right? But if they don't fulfill this contract, who is responsible? Who is accountable? Is it the brand? Is it the dealer? Well, we learned the hard way that the brand is ultimately responsible. Even if you have it stipulated in your contract with the direct dealer that they're responsible for compliant translations. I'm going to give a couple of examples of what happened. If you want to move to the next slide, Coleman, or whoever's navigating. So, one of the days, again, the OPC entered one of the dealerships in the French Canadian speaking areas in Canada, and they identified the products, apparel, leather jackets, helmet, gloves, parts and accessories for the bike. All of these products did not have any French Canadian labels on them. So they confiscated most of the products, as you can see in the screenshot with the green label, and they shut down the dealership. You can see the suspension shine on the entrance of the dealership for 2 months. And that was an enough indicator for the OPC to target the remaining dealerships in French-speaking areas. So within 48 hours, they had already visited 2 other dealerships and done the same in terms of confiscating products and also shutting down the dealerships. So in terms of localization, we were quite agile. We flew in and we went with the dealer. We collected the requirements. We started localizing very quickly. And within a week, we had the translations ready or the labels ready to be compliant. But the legal process took time. The proceedings for lifting the suspension took time. So it took 8 weeks to reopen 3 dealerships around Canada. And that gives you an idea of not just the fines or the legal fines that we had to deal with as a brand, but also the image was impacted and the loss of sales. We're talking about millions here. Eventually, we reopened the dealership, so we started working very closely. We took the necessary steps to collect the information, work with compliance, have a local agent identify the legal and compliance needs, and then we followed we devised a new strategy for the Canadian market. I wanted to share some examples around compliance in Canada. Compliance is not an option. And if you want to enter this market, you really want to spend some time on due diligence and not underestimate the requirements or treat this market like you treat other markets. Because again, the OPC is very strict, and it's for legitimate reasons, but they're also very agile and quick. So the minute they identify that the big logo or the brand has an issue in a certain brick and mortar environment, they're going to move to the next and to the next. And localizing and being agile and turning around localization does not mean that the suspension of your store or of your dealership is going to be lifted quickly. This process could take for months, and it will impact your brand image and, most importantly, your revenue.
Hey, thank you, Wada'a. That was a dramatic and kind of scary story on the experience of Harley-Davidson. And bear in mind, this was also several years ago. This was before Bill 96 went into effect. So you can imagine that it's only gotten more extreme since then. So we will have a Q&A session, but please, anybody on the call, again, a reminder, you can use the Q&A button to drop any questions in at any time. And at this moment, I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Carrie Fischer of Subway, and she's going to talk a little bit about that brand's experience in Canada. And Carrie, I'll advance the slides whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready. I love the image. I hope it makes everybody hungry, at least for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or whatever you like. So do you want to advance the slide, or do I? Okay. So if you haven't heard of Subway, we're the largest fast food chain in the world. So we have over 37,000 restaurants worldwide in over 100 countries. Canada alone is 3,300. Quebec has more restaurants than France at this point. So pretty important province for us. Subway only offers franchises. Yay, I know, right? We don't own any of the restaurants ourselves, unlike McDonald's, I believe. They are starting to buy back their own restaurants. We don't do that. It's 100% people owned restaurants. So it's their own business. And then we provide a turnkey solution for all locations. So we've got operations manuals in I don't know how many languages at this point. We give the franchisee everything they need to open up a restaurant in whatever location they choose. And the franchisee is responsible for really adhering to all of the brand standards. We give them all the tools to help them open a restaurant and maintain it. So that's Subway in a nutshell. If we want to head to the next one. So we've been localizing into French Canadian since I started 8 years ago. We have always localized guest-facing content like the app, the website, the in-store signage, and all that menus, right? Everything. And that screenshot below the guest-facing content is from Quebec. Ironically, it has a picture of the Eiffel Tower in the background, but that's just a contest. So if you want to win a trip, the NBA is playing in Paris, so buy a sandwich, get to win a trip to Paris. And then the internal training, we've always, localized as well, how to prepare the food, how to operate, how to the equipment and clean it, how to clean the restaurant, clean the facility. This is a screenshot from. There was a question actually in the Q&A. Does French have to cover the training? Sure does. Those are employees of a French Canadian restaurant, and everything has to be in French. So it's really interesting. Wada'a mentioned that it's really, important to be compliant. I remember back in the day when there was one French, and we were localizing websites or software, and one French and one universal Spanish, got it. That was fine. That is not the case anymore. And I was really schooled by French Canadian employees in Subway. And it was great because I speak French. And so my colleague explained what the differences were between French Canadian and French in France. And it was fascinating. And it was over dinner, over drinks, and he spoke to me in French, and I understood everything he said. So that was really interesting, and it was really, I thought, a good lesson because they are two different languages. I don't care what you say. They are, and the pronunciation is quite different. Everyone can understand each other, but the pronunciation is different. So, when in doubt, if in doubt, translate it. And I don't know what the next slide holds. It's a mystery. All right. Yes. So, Bill 96 came around 2 years ago. And what changed for Subway is we had always provided French Canadian materials to the sandwich artists, right? There's someone handing you your sandwich right there. And for the most part, the franchisees, but anything, franchisee or business development facing had to be in French. Any article, any announcement of any kind now has to go into French Canadian. All of the legal contracts, we would have maybe English contracts, or we would have like dual column, the bilingual contracts, whatever you want to call it, with English on the left and French on the right. Now we have to have French contracts, and it's up to the franchisee if I want my contract in English or if I want my contract in French. These contracts have to be identical in content. We can't mess around with translation. We can't be creative. Not that legal contracts are creative terribly, but it's very important to have your terminology determined well in advance of translation. What are we calling a franchisee? What's that translation? Is it franchise owner? Is it franchisee? Everything has to be thought of up front. And then any signs, of course, in restaurant windows in Quebec, or there's French-speaking portions in New Brunswick, we found out. So, gotta have those in French. When Bill 96 became, well, law, it was immediate. We had immediate government officials in Quebec, looking at restaurants, and we were cited. It was a sign that I think was in English, one of those peel-off things, right? That was on a window in Quebec, and we were cited. We were told, if you don't fix this, within 24 to 48 hours, whatever it was, you will be fined. And I don't remember, it was like 20 or 30,000 bucks, right? It was serious stuff. We didn't get shut down like Harley-Davidson. At least they gave us that, right? But we had to act right away. So that sign came down. I was notified. We got the French, up and running, and a new sticker or whatever was created. It was very intense, but had to be done. So Bill 96, we don't mess around. As soon as that was put into law, the country director at the time said, everything is in French. I know we don't know how the government wants us to enact exactly, what goes into French. He said, I don't care. Everything, absolutely everything is in French. This was huge for us as well, because in every conference, in every get together, right, in Quebec, now I had to have live interpreters. Never had that before. So everything has to be in French.
Okay, so thank you both, Carrie and Wada'a, for your contribution on that and those case studies. Both of you having had experience with the Canadian legislation firsthand, and I am happy to then now hand it over to Jean-Luc. So Jean-Luc, if you're good, I'm going to hand it over to you and turn off the mic.
Thanks, Coleman. And then thanks again, Carrie and Wada'a, for joining. I think we can have a nice little discussion here and discuss the challenges that you guys faced. And I know, for example, we see that in this slide right here, it says localize everything. And I know that we've spoken to a couple of customers in the past 6 months or so, and they came to us in a little bit of a panic. They said suddenly realized that we have millions of words to translate into French. Was it for you, Carrie and Wada'a, a surprise when you were told that you have to translate things for Bill 96 in Canada? Was it a surprise how much content you had to translate? Maybe Carrie?
Yeah. I'll be completely honest. I was not following Canadian legislation. And all of a sudden, Bill 96 hit, and I was like, what? Luckily, we have a legal team in Quebec. And one person in particular reached out and sent me the bill and said, okay, this is what's happening. We have to make sure that, we're compliant. And, these are the sections I want you to read, which is helpful. No, it's not my job to make sure we're compliant. Right? That's legal. That's the country director. But they informed me, and they wanted me to read all about Bill 96 and how it pertained to us, because it went from being, we have to translate into French Canadian to, no, here's all, franchisees are considered employees of Subway. And therefore, everybody who works for the franchisees, like the sandwich artists, the managers, whatever, are considered employees. So, boom, everything, absolutely everything, had to be in French. someone even asked, I think it was in one of the Q&A or in the chat, what the percentage is, or, I once, did a return on investment, an ROI calculation. And honestly, what we spend on translation is nothing compared to what we make, right?
Mhm.
So it's worth it. It's absolutely, I know it's a different market, it's Subway, right? But it's absolutely worth it to translate into French Canadian. We're not losing money, and we're making sure that we're compliant. But yes, it was quite a surprise.
Sure. How about for you, Wada?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was a surprise for us, because we were solid from a CX experience perspective. As you know, Harley-Davidson was an iconic brand, so the budget for brand and trans creation was huge. Also, from a tech pop perspective, meaning owner's manuals, service manuals, those big buckets where you're looking at thousands and thousands of words, these were already translated. Because if you don't translate or localize owner's manuals and service manuals, bikes don't ship anyway out of the US. I think the challenge was with the small parts and accessories and general merchandising at the dealership level. And this is where they caught us. We had the content, we had the translation memories. So as I said earlier, we were quite agile in responding to the needs of the market, but I wouldn't say it was a surprise. And then when I look at the bill now and the deadline, I think it existed 10 years ago or more, but now it's official because the OPC throughout this process, they realized that a lot of these requirements were not actually documented in a single source of truth. So going after big logos was not that easy either. It was fast. The fines were big and fairly sizable, but now it's official. So they could go even faster in terms of applying and enforcing these laws. In terms of the budget, as Carrie mentioned, it's totally worth it because Canada is not just a tier one market, but also the risks outweigh the cost of the translation. And the way you can evangelize this internally, if you're on the corporate buyer side of the business, you tie it to compliance. You show the numbers. If we do not translate, this is going to be the loss of sales in terms of numbers. If we translate, that's going to be the budget. When you put these numbers side by side with E staff and C staff, if you're having the conversation, it's a no-brainer. So definitely recommend localizing everything. I don't think it's unwise to do so because, again, the risks outweigh the cost of the translation. Better you have everything than be caught and fined and have your store shut down for a month because a single label or a minor mislocalization.
So when we talk about this aspect of, like, first of all, finding the information, and then for you, Wada and Carrie, the fact that maybe for you, Carrie, is a bit more surprising, the quantity that need to be translated, maybe Wada not as much, except that maybe there's some things that were missed. If you were like, we have people here in the attendance, maybe they say, we haven't started yet to prepare for Bill 96. What would you tell them? Like, where should they start right now? I know Coleman mentioned, like, working, for example, with your legal and compliance department, but that's just one step. What would be, for example, steps that you would recommend that people start doing today if you wanted to prepare for Bill 96? And maybe what at this time you can start first,
Yeah, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, in order to fit the profile, you have to have a brick and mortar environment. And this is where the OPC can walk in and actually look at signs and look at materials. So anything that is print, prioritize it right away. Legal documentation, prioritize it right away. Anything that is inside the brick and mortar environment, from signs to ads to job aids, also banners, tags, make sure to localize it. That's going to be your phase one. And then phase two would be anything ads related. And that's the digital world, because it is also required but it requires research. And even in the bill itself, there are no specifics around digital content. So your website, and I'm not saying here to put it on hold or to pause it. And definitely, as Coleman said at the beginning of the webinar, please consult with your legal entity, and it's all driven by industry, right? I'm sharing my experience on the motorcycling side of things. So definitely consult with your legal entity. But if you were in a motorcycling field or automotive field and you have a brick and mortar environment, I would say prioritize anything that is print related, anything that is visible inside the brick and mortar environment.
Mm-hmm. And for you, Carrie, was it the same experience as well?
Yes, that's exactly right. Anything that somebody can come into your restaurant and see has to be localized. And the contracts, I think, are important as well. And we ended up doing a lot. As I was thinking about what had to happen 2 years ago, besides going over budget, it was just, backlog, right? It was a big backlog of e-learning. Most of it was e-learning, So yes, we offered this course in, I couldn't even tell you, right? It kind of obscure stuff, but we had to do it. And even though it could have been out of date, it was just, that's what we ended up starting. So we did start with whatever was in the restaurant, as well as legal contracts. But then it was, let's get to the backlog of all the e-learning stuff that you never did. So, an enormous amount of content.
So actually, what we're talking about, said that, legals and compliance team should be working with you guys, but at the same time, it looks like working with the local teams is very important as well. So like we were talking, like with Taking Point, for example, on this effort, legal and compliance, maybe they're the one that have to analyze the bills. But then I think, as what I was saying, like maybe working with the dealers, making sure that, like you said, everything in the store gets translated. Same thing for you, Carrie, everything that's in the stores, because you're not necessarily inside the store, right? So the local people, they might actually know better what they have, rather than you guys. And then on your side, working with other teams internally, is there anything else that people see? I mean, once again, I don't know which organization you have, but that includes a lot of different people that need to be basically read into the process. Is that correct, Carrie?
It is. And luckily in Quebec, we have a few, thank goodness, outspoken franchisees. And in fact, one of them, his nickname is Poppy. But he was super helpful in helping us kind of, organize what we needed to translate and by when. So yeah, I would say it does help to have great contacts locally to help the business. But again, the direction came from the country manager at the time, who's now, by the way, in charge of all of North America. So certainly proven his worth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now that I see that Coleman just brought him that slides about technology, because I think it's an important factor. We have, for example, I was telling you, we have customers that came to us and say, look, we realized we have 2, 3, 4 million words that need to be translated into French we didn't have. Maybe a question about technology is that, because maybe people might not be aware, but is, for example, if you want to translate something fast, is AI translation sufficient to meet the requirements? Maybe Wada'a, maybe do you know this, or do you need to have AI transition plus post-editing to meet the requirements?
Certainly. I would like to say, though, speed, if you already encountered the compliance issue, and let's say your store is impacted or the dealership is shut down, speed is not going to help. Speed and localization will not help, because, as I mentioned earlier, the legal proceedings to lift the suspension take time. So that's why better be safe than sorry. Preventive action would be to localize everything. Now, for those of you or in the audience who are just embarking or entering the Canadian market, LLMs will certainly help with long form content, that does not have an aspect of CX experience, because transcreation is going to be front and center too. So you cannot leverage LLMs for highly creative content. And that also goes back to how iconic and how creative your brand is. So for example, at Harley-Davidson, English wasn't even English. You had expressions like dress up the dresser. The dresser is the touring bike, and you can dress it up and you can dress it down. So an LLM or a solid machine translation is not going to be able to render this for you. So if you're part of an iconic brand, I would say isolate the transcreation creative content from an LLM or MT perspective, run all of the legal documentation and the long form content that has a technical aspect to it, like owner's manuals, service manuals. This is where the millions of words are. Run them through LLMs. If you have disclaimers, you want to categorize the content. So for example, even in an owner's manual or a service manual that is word to word, you might have some disclaimers that are not relevant to the Canadian market. So this is when you work closely with your compliance team and ask them to advise and provide counsel on what disclaimers work and not work for Canada. Also, tags and packaging and labeling I wouldn't recommend running it through MT or LLMs, because for example, there's a requirement in Canada for gloves to include the ingredients. This is not a requirement here in the US. You don't even have it in English, right? But in Canada, they require more details around how the product was built. So there's a lot of due diligence and prep work that needs to take place with these items before you kick off the localization process. I also recommend to not take anything or don't let anybody put on your plate things that are out of scope or outside of your core competency. If you're running localization, you're not a legal entity. You don't have a legal background. And we've seen this in corporate America, where they come in and say, tell me what I need to translate or localize to be compliant in a certain market. You want to push back right away and say, sure, we will work with you and the compliance team, because the due diligence has to be done by the compliance team and you are in an execution capacity. So I'd like to point that out because it's going to surface at some point.
Okay. It looks like we're answering some of the questions from the audience that are in the Q&A section, so like you were talking about using AI, and I'm guessing, Carrie, it's the same thing for you as well. Using AI definitely makes a difference. I mean, people come to us and say, if I have to translate 2 million words and we have to do human translation, the cost could be pretty dramatic, so using AI, and I don't know if you're working with vendors, did they use AI? Did they use post-editing for a lot of the content, or just like straight AI as well? So
mostly machine translation with that human post-edit. So, as you can imagine, we have to get it right. Nutritional information, allergens, I can't rely on AI to get that right. Because if you screw that up, somebody could really get sick. For me, I think the restaurant business is a little bit niche, and in that, I have to make sure that the translations are 100% accurate on how to use a slicer, how to use the speed oven. Otherwise, people could get hurt. So AI definitely has a place in translation. I'm not saying that at all. And I have used it many times. But I do have to have the human in the loop, right?
Of course.
That has to happen.
Exactly. And then leveraging, and I think it looks like in some cases just leveraging you in-country specialists, working with colleagues in Canada to monitor the quality. I mean, you could work with vendors, you can work with translators, but working with your local team to make sure that the quality is where you want it to be. So having that collaborative aspect of the platform. So
and they're quite open. So if I get something wrong, they're very, very good at letting me know.
Exactly. So I think we answered most of the questions. If you're using Smartcat, or a question about Smartcat, if you're using Smartcat for a French Canadian translation, can we be sure that translations are compliant? I think it's just a matter of having people like, like Carrie was saying, and like, what I was saying, having human in the loops, that's really what ensures that your transition is compliant is not the tool itself. And it's the process and the people that are part of the process, so just keep that in mind. Yeah, and then also people, I think, were asking, like, if YouTube content also is like, would be needed to be like, your social media content, would that need to be translated? I think those are also pretty interesting questions. And I don't know, maybe maybe if you guys had like, YouTube content that you translated into French for the market, or maybe that was not, needed.
I'm sorry, on the social media front?
Yes. Did you find yourself needing to translate also social media content like Instagram
Sure.
post or YouTube, like briefly?
So it's part of events and anything that has to do with social media in terms of promoting the events or the latest news. And this is part of transcreation. So AI was not engaged in that process. We did not engage AI because, again, you have to navigate those linguistic and cultural waters while preserving the integrity of the Harley-Davidson brand. But the answer is yes, because not just Canada is not only a tier 1 market, but it's also very unique when it comes to language. And the English that we had was not even English. So imagine this at a 40 character limitation. So the social media strategy for transcreation was very specific. We had a big budget for it. But I wouldn't say it's a high compliance risk in Canada. It was not a target because, again, it was digital. The high risk is more of in a brick and mortar environment.
Okay. How can we be sure our transition are compliant with Canadian law? Again, that's part of the process. The people you work with, the local people, you work with like, vendors or translators. I think this is like, how will you define what localization is to a student who wants to explore this field of study? I think this is maybe, Sarah, you asked this question. Maybe you could just go into our website. We have some information about the translation world.
And connect with us. I would recommend just connecting with Wada'a and myself. And I'm sure we'd be happy to talk to you about the localization world within academia. It's quite fascinating.
Yep, absolutely. Marielle asked also, if we send a transactional email, is it okay to send in English and include a link to the French Canadian version? How does that work? Do you guys know?
We don't. It's French Canadian out of the gate. I'm in the middle of translating email templates right now about guest care, right? And somebody's experience in a restaurant. And there's probably 50 emails and it's a transactional email. It's in French Canadian out of the gate. We don't send a link to a French Canadian version. It's French.
Okay, so that answers also a question about internal communications, so everything is in French right now when it's related to the French Canadian market, so we also discussed about using AI to comply with language requirements for sure, so that was actually a pretty elaborate discussion. We talked about social media. Someone asked a question about using Smartcat. But yes, Smartcat is part of the process, so if you have online selection tools only in English, are we required to make this bilingual as well? I don't know if that's the case for you guys, like someone goes to like your website and they have like online tools. I don't know if that's the case with you guys. Maybe you guys are like, people want to like maybe buy a bike or something and do the bike customization. Was that translated as well?
Certainly. So there are two tools, actually. We had two tools. One of them was the dealer training tool, and the user face had to be localized. So usually for a dealer training perspective, and this is, you can call it the e-learning for dealers, how to set up a bike and so forth and so on. For many markets, we kept the user interface in English, and then the content was available in the local language, except for Canada, where the dealer training, user interface, and content were in French Canadian, because we did not want to take any chances. The other tool was, to your point, Jean-Luc, the customization of a bike. And that is actually customized and globalized for each and every market, because you had the option of selecting a bike and going into your environment. So you might have, I don't know, if you're globalizing or if you're customizing for China, you might have the Great Wall as a background. If you're customizing for France, you might have the Tour Eiffel. So definitely from a tool perspective, do not take any chances. Make sure that you have the user interface, so anything at the back end, also localized into French Canadian.
Okay, sounds good. And then I think someone had a question about product names that are typically left in English, but I'm guessing in most cases that was your case. Oh no, actually that's not true, Carrie. You were showing like a sign when actually your Subway, the 12-inch whatever was translated actually, right? So
it's not a foot long in Canada. It's a pouce. It's called.
Very interesting. Okay, so
yeah, it's fun. I have to say, thank you for this question, because this is like, I think the best part of my job is coming up with names in Quebec for our sandwiches, and of course they have products that we don't have here in the States. That we just launched potato rings. Why don't we have potato rings in the States? There's so many amazing, menu items that they come up with, but yes, like
poutine.
All American Club doesn't really cut it, in Canada. So, we have Club du Pays.
There you go.
Canuck Classic. So, even coming up with, names for the rewards program, the MVP rewards program, that doesn't make any sense outside of the United States. So it was Les Récompenses Étoiles, Star, rewards. It's, I would say it's the most fun part of my job is to help come up with names for, localized regions. A lot of fun.
Great. Thank you. I think we covered everything right now, Coleman,
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Wada'a. Thank you, Carrie, for those amazing stories and your input. Thank you, Jean-Luc, for guiding us through the Q&A section, and especially for all of you participants. Thank you for joining us. As you can see on the screen, the recording will be available shortly. And if you have any questions, or if you want to get the contact information of Wada'a and Carrie, please just reach out to us and we will be happy to share that information. And as I mentioned, we also have a one-pager that we will be sending to you that just as a high-level summary of the various regulations that we talked about. And with that, we'll wrap it up and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye, everybody.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.